Welcome back. We are back with Carl B. Johnson from Cleared Systems. And today we would like to talk about CUI. It's a topic on everyone's mind if you work with the federal government or you're preparing for a CMMC audit. So, Carl, hello. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me back. Could you explain for us, please, what exactly is CUI?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's funny that we're having this conversation because like you said, it comes up I think almost every day, and it's sometimes explained a little bit more complex than it needs to be. So I hope I do a great job in explaining and try to simplify it as much as possible. I'll start with the roots of CUI, and first what CUI means is just controlled unclassified information. But its roots goes back to March the 6th of 2020, when the Office of the Undersecretary of the Defense for Intelligence and Security basically released the DoD instruction on how to mark and how to identify any information that was related to the DoD. And the reason why I said this is an alphabetical soup, and even just saying the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, right? It's all these agencies that are involved in it. But what it really means is how information is identified that belongs to the Department of Defense, that is shared with federal contractors, whether that's inside of an agency or outside of an agency. And so what was happening before CUI is that each agency had its own markings or its own kind of category on its data that it held. Perfect example is that you would see things such as FOIA eyes only or FOIA. You would see that on documents every now and then. That all came from where the DoD said we have to mark these documents a certain way. You know, if you look back at those old movies and you see those little stamps that said classified. Well, when we're talking about CUI, think of unclassified information, but still has some sensitivity levels to it. Within CUI, you do have different categories, and I'll discuss some of them in our conversation today. But the most important part with CUI is understanding that how do you mark the documents that you do communicate back and forth with the federal government, whether we're talking about the DoD or Department of Commerce, FBI, et cetera, any of those agencies. How do you mark those documents so that way you know that these documents have different regulatory or different compliance requirements than, say, your documents that you deal with inside your organization. So it's the bigger scope of it also is if you're familiar with PII, which is your social security number or date of birth. Well, think of when we're talking about CUI, it's still under that same umbrella, right? So PII is not obviously classified, but it's still considered sensitive. It's still in nature, if someone gets a hold of that information, they could do a lot of damage, right? We hear about data breaches on a daily basis. With your CUI, the federal government wants to make sure that whoever is holding their information outside of their agencies are making sure that the information is stored in the right place, and making sure that only personnel that should have access to that information can see that information. So in a nutshell, in a high level, that's what we are talking about when we talk about CUI. You may also hear the words such as CDI pop up, which just stands for Covered Defense Information. You may also hear the terminology of Controlled Technical Information, CTI. Again, the like I said when we started this, Susan, it's just an alphabetical soup. But with your CUI, think of your CUI as your umbrella of whether we're talking about CDI, whether we're talking about CTI, whether we're talking about PII, anything that relates to the business of the federal government, specifically in this case, Department of Defense, we would categorize it as CUI.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. So, this is great going forward, but what about all the older archived records? How is that dealt with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, especially organizations, because CUI is pretty new, right? It's only been around for a few years now, and even if we're talking about markings themselves, with now that we're in the age of everything is in the cloud, and we're talking about things like SharePoint or file storage. For documents that you have or records that you have prior that you have in archive or in storage, there is tools out there. Off the top of my head, obviously Microsoft with using labeling, or what we call unified labeling. If you're not using Microsoft, or maybe you're in like an Amazon tenant, there's products like Titus, which is great at identifying COI documents. It uses artificial intelligence to identify that this is a actual COI document, and can help and mark the actual document itself. With this video, I'll also include an example of what a marked document looks like. And to your point, if you have, sometimes you have terabytes and terabytes of documents going back for many, many years. No one expects you to go back and mark each and every one of those documents. Instead, what I would recommend is address those in your poem, along with your SSP or your system security plan, to basically say, you know what, Mr. Auditor, we recognize that we have all these documents going back for many, many years, but from this day forward, we have implemented a CUI program, and we're using whether Titus or Microsoft to categorize and label and mark the documents going forward, so that we can identify the documents that do belong to the federal government, and that they're highly protected.
So, it seems like I could see how larger organizations, governmental organizations, could get a handle on CUI. It seems like a lot of work for small organizations. Are there any tools that can help with markings for records and documents specifically for small organizations?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so most definitely, I would say Titus, even for small organizations, Titus is a great tool to start with. I think also to add to this is that, especially in smaller organizations, like you say, you may not have the infrastructure to go out and spend, $500,000 just on upgrading your systems alone to fortify the information. What I would recommend is to either use your existing architecture, your IT architecture, and put your CUI documents on premise, just making sure that the security model you've chosen complies with your NIST SP 800-171. And that's why I said also in the beginning, I think that when we're talking about CUI and we're talking about CMMC, that everyone kind of looks at the more complex route to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. But really, what you already have as a small organization is good enough. If you do have, if you're SMB, small, medium business, and you do have, a budget, obviously I'm a little biased to Microsoft, but I recommend, migrating over into your Microsoft GCC and GCC High. And I'll leave a link to the video that Susan and I we did earlier or last week, which talks about migrating to Microsoft GCC and GCC High. But you really, as a small organization, you don't have a huge budget to protect CUI. I know it is scary when you look at a contract with the federal government, and in the fine print it says that you must have a compliant, NIST 800 or SP 800 171 compliant way of storing our CUI. But there are budget-friendly ways of protecting the government's data, whether that's in the cloud through like Microsoft or Amazon, or even on premise, using what you currently have and just fortifying it so that it does comply with NIST SP 800 171.
Thank you for that. So, okay, so you've covered budget for, guiding businesses on managing CUI. Do you have any other guidance outside of budgetary, concerns about managing CUI?
Yes, I think that's a good point. I think it's really about in the first rule of any security is less privilege. So just kind of I always think of things in a more physical aspect when we're talking about cybersecurity. Think of a door, and you're not monitoring who's coming in and out of that door. You don't know who exactly is in the building. You don't know who has left the building. Think of that the exact same, example when we're talking about CUI, is that the most important part is limiting the access to the information, so that the whole entire organization doesn't have to have NATO category or financial category to a CUI document that you may be storing. And think of also, or work with also your FSO, your federal security officer, which you might have one on site that can help create a CUI program. But the most important part is don't overcomplicate it. With CUI, really at the end of the day, is about data types, categories, what type of category that you're working with the government, whether it's financial, whether it's like I said, NATO, or if it's for export, like if we're talking about ITAR, things like that. It's a way of categorizing that data. And in the world we live in today, everything has data. The federal government just wants to make sure that you are categorizing their data so that it can fit to the right policy, regulation, or compliance that they have for that data and when it's being stored.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your insight, and it's always very enlightening talking to you about these subjects. So thank you for clearing up CUI, and I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you, Susan. I love talking about this. It's to me it's a very important subject, especially with data breaches and cybersecurity being on the front of everyone's mind. I think just about every day I myself encounter where someone is trying to breach a system of some type, or some kind of testing how secure our systems are. Or I hear horror stories from customers where they were part of a data breach. So I just think that CUI and just understanding your security posture as an organization, especially as a federal contractor, is important. So I could talk about this all day if we want. It's great stuff to me.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for all of everything that you shared. We appreciate it. And I know I will see you next time. Have a
Absolutely.
great day.
Have a great day, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.